Officer Danny Martinez had been working on Highway 87 for 6 years now, and he thought he knew every trick in the book. The desert road cut through Arizona like a long snake, and it connected the military bases to the small towns where regular people lived. On this hot Tuesday afternoon, he saw a black motorcycle zoom past, his hiding spot at 75 miles per hour when the limit was only 60. He turned on his lights and pulled out from behind the big billboard where he always waited. The motorcycle kept going for a while, and Danny felt annoyed because the rider should have stopped right away. After about half a mile, the bike finally started slowing down and pulled over to the side of the road in a smooth way that made Danny think this guy had done this before. Danny got out of his car and walked toward the motorcycle, with his hand near his gun like he always did. The rider got off his bike and stood there waiting. He wore a leather jacket even though it was blazing hot outside, and his boots looked old and worn out. His helmet was still on, so Danny could not see his face yet. The rider took off his helmet, and Danny saw a man who looked about 40 years old with blue eyes that seemed calm and maybe a little bit amused by all this. His face was tan from being in the sun a lot, and he had the kind of build that came from either hard work or military training. Danny said what he always said during stops like this. "License and registration, please." The man nodded and reached into his jacket real slow, like he wanted to make sure Danny did not get nervous. Then the man said something that Danny had never heard before during a traffic stop. He said his name was Sergeant First Class Kyle Bennett from the United States Army Special Forces, and he was traveling under priority orders right now. Danny had heard lots of excuses over the years, but this guy said it in a flat voice like he was just stating facts and not trying to get out of trouble. Danny told him that was fine, but he was still speeding, and he still needed to see his license and registration and all that. Kyle handed everything over without arguing. His military ID looked real, and it showed his rank and his unit, and something about a security clearance that made Danny pause for a second. The photo matched the guy standing in front of him. Kyle looked at Danny's name tag and said he understood about the ticket. Then he said something strange. He said that in the next few minutes, Danny was going to get a call from someone important, and the whole situation was going to get weird in a way that might not make sense. Danny frowned because he did not know if this was a threat or just a warning. Before he could say anything, his radio came alive with static and then a voice. It was Linda Hayes from dispatch, and she sounded stressed out, which was not normal for her. She asked Danny where he was and what he was doing. Danny pressed the button on his radio and told her he was doing a traffic stop on Highway 87 at mile marker 42. There was a pause, and then Linda came back on and asked if the vehicle was a black Harley-Davidson with a specific registration number. Danny looked at the paper in his hand, and the numbers matched exactly. He said yes and started to ask how she knew that, but Linda cut him off. She said to stand by because there was a priority call coming through and they were transferring it to his car right now. This had never happened before in 6 years. Danny walked back to his patrol car and picked up the phone. Kyle stayed by his motorcycle and did not move at all. His face showed nothing. The phone clicked and a woman's voice came through sharp and clear. She said her name was Colonel Patricia Hughes from United States Army Intelligence Command, and she asked if she was talking to Officer Daniel Martinez, badge number 427. Danny felt his stomach get tight. He said, "Yes, ma'am, this is Officer Martinez." The colonel said that Danny had detained Sergeant First Class Kyle Bennett and asked if that was correct. Danny said, "Yes, ma'am, for speeding, ma'am." The colonel told Danny to listen very carefully. She said that Kyle was traveling under priority alpha orders for a national security matter, and his timeline was very tight. She said she appreciated Danny doing his job, but she was formally asking him to let Kyle go right now so he could continue his trip. Danny looked back at Kyle, who was still standing there looking at the horizon like none of this mattered to him. Danny told the colonel that he needed to verify all this because he got people claiming military stuff all the time. The colonel said she expected that and told Danny to check his computer in the car. He should see a verification code and contact information for the Pentagon. Danny checked, and sure enough, there was a message with codes and a Washington phone number and a reference number. The system also showed a flag on Kyle's license that said, "Federal Priority Status." Danny said he saw the code. The colonel said good, and then she said something that made Danny's heart beat faster. She said that in about 3 minutes, Danny was going to have company, because Kyle had a support team that was tracking him, and they knew about this stop. and they were coming to his location right now. She said she wanted to call Danny first to explain things and hopefully make it all go smoothly. Danny asked what she meant by support team. The colonel said yes, Officer Martinez, a support team, and she recommended that he stay calm when they showed up, because they were just following their rules and nothing more. Then the line went dead. Danny stood there holding the phone, trying to understand what just happened. Support team coming to his location. He looked down the empty highway and saw nothing but heat waves and desert. Then from the north he heard engines. Big heavy engines that were getting louder. Danny looked up the road and his eyes went wide as dark shapes started appearing through the shimmering heat. Not one vehicle, not two. A whole convoy of military trucks was coming fast and they were heading straight for him. The sound of the engines grew louder and louder like thunder rolling across the desert. Danny put his hand over his eyes to block the sun and watched as the shapes got clearer and bigger. The first Humvee came over the hill doing at least 80 miles per hour, and behind it came another one and then another one. Danny started counting them as they got closer. 5 vehicles, then 6, then 7. All of them in a tight line like they had practiced this 100 times. Kyle finally moved and turned to watch the convoy coming toward them. His face showed something that might have been a small smile, or maybe he was just tired of waiting. It was hard to tell what he was thinking. The first Humvee hit its brakes hard and the tires made a loud sound as it pulled off the highway right in front of Danny's patrol car. Now Danny was blocked in and could not leave even if he wanted to. The other vehicles spread out around them like they were setting up a perimeter. Dust flew up from the desert floor as each truck stopped and settled into position. Danny's hand moved toward his gun without him thinking about it, but then he stopped. He was one cop with one pistol and there were military vehicles all around him with who knows how many soldiers inside. Drawing his gun would be the stupidest thing he could do right now. The back door of the lead Humvee opened and a man stepped out into the bright sunlight. He wore an army uniform with captain's bars on his chest and an American flag patch on his shoulder. The man looked about 45 years old with gray hair cut very short, and he walked like someone who had been in the military his whole life. Behind him, soldiers started getting out of the other vehicles and every single one of them was armed and watching Danny. The captain walked straight toward Danny, but he was not aggressive about it. He stopped a few feet away and gave Danny a small nod like they were just 2 professionals meeting on the street. He said his name was Captain Paul Stevens from United States Army Special Operations Command, and he apologized for the dramatic entrance. His voice was calm and polite, but Danny could hear the authority in it. Danny found his voice even though it came out rougher than he wanted. He said he had just done a routine traffic stop and Kyle had been going 15 miles over the limit. That was all this was supposed to be. Captain Stevens said he knew that, and under normal circumstances he would completely support Danny writing a ticket. But these were not normal circumstances. He pointed at Kyle, who had put his helmet back on and was checking his motorcycle like he was getting ready to leave. The captain said Kyle was operating under time-sensitive orders that involved national security, and he had been tasked with making sure Kyle reached his destination on time. Danny said the colonel had mentioned that part already. He looked around at all the soldiers standing there watching him. He said this seemed like way too much for just a speeding ticket. Captain Stevens smiled a little bit, but his eyes stayed serious. He said Danny was absolutely right and this was excessive. But Kyle was not just any regular soldier, and his mission was not just any regular assignment. They had been tracking Kyle since he left Fort Bragg 4 days ago, and when he stopped their rules said they had to respond immediately. Danny asked what kind of mission needed this much support. The captain said it was the kind he could not discuss with civilian law enforcement. But he could tell Danny that Kyle had about 48 hours to get to a location in Nevada, and this delay had already cost them 12 minutes. The captain pulled out a military ID card and handed it to Danny. He said Danny could verify his credentials and call his supervisor and even write Kyle a ticket if he really wanted to. But he was asking Danny as one professional to another to please let them go. Danny looked at the ID card. It looked real and it matched the same style as Kyle's card. He looked past the captain at all the soldiers standing around with their weapons. There had to be at least 50 of them out here in the middle of nowhere just because one motorcycle got pulled over for speeding. Danny took a slow breath and tried to think. From one point of view, he was outnumbered, and this was clearly something bigger than his normal job. From another point of view, he still had the legal authority to enforce traffic laws no matter who these people were. But from a common sense point of view, this Whole thing had gone way past a simple traffic ticket and he needed to figure out what to do. He told Captain Stevens that he was not trying to mess with military business, but he had a responsibility for public safety on this highway. If Kyle was going to keep speeding and if there was going to be a military convoy following him, then Danny needed to know they understood the risks. Captain Stevens nodded, and his face got more serious. He said he appreciated Danny's position, and he would explain what he could. He said Kyle was a combat veteran with 16 years of service. He had done 4 deployments in war zones, and he had medals for bravery. His motorcycle skills were exceptional, and his trip was being watched by satellite and drone surveillance right now. They were not asking him to drive crazy. They were asking him to make up time when it was safe to do so. Danny said satellite surveillance for a motorcycle trip. The captain said, like he told Danny before, this was not a normal assignment. He looked back at Kyle, who was standing by his bike, clearly ready to leave. The captain said Kyle had volunteered for a mission that needed someone with his exact skills to be in a specific place at a specific time. The details were classified above both their pay grades. What he could say was that if Kyle succeeded, it could save lives. Danny felt the weight of those words. Save lives. He had become a cop to protect people and serve his community. If what the captain said was true, then stopping this soldier from finishing his mission might cause problems way bigger than a speeding ticket. Danny asked what would happen if Kyle did not make it in time. Captain Stevens was quiet for a moment and his jaw got tight. He said then someone else would have to try the mission with less training and less experience, and a much lower chance of success. Kyle was their first choice for a reason. A car drove past on the highway and the driver slowed down to stare at all the military vehicles and the flashing police lights. The person in the car looked confused and maybe a little scared before they hit the gas and drove away fast. Danny watched them go and shook his head. He said this was going to draw a lot of attention from people driving by. Captain Stevens said they knew that already, and they had a team getting ready to tell the public this was just a training exercise. Danny's department would get official notice about it within the hour. The captain pulled out his phone and showed Danny a document on the screen. He said he had authorization codes that would satisfy Danny's bosses. He also had phone numbers for the Pentagon and the Department of Defense and, if needed, the governor's office. Danny had never felt so far out of his depth in his whole career. He had pulled over a speeding motorcycle, and now he was standing in the middle of what looked like some kind of secret military operation. He asked the captain what Priority Alpha meant exactly. The captain said it meant that under federal law, military operations with Priority Alpha status took precedence over local and state police actions when there was a direct conflict. It did not mean they could ignore all laws, but it gave them room to maneuver when time was critical. The captain looked Danny straight in the eyes. He said he was not trying to pull rank or push Danny around. He was asking Danny to understand the bigger picture here. Danny walked back to his patrol car because he needed a minute to think. He could insist on writing the ticket and follow every single rule in the book. But what would that really do? Delay a mission that involved national security. Create a fight between agencies that would probably get overruled by someone higher up anyway. None of that made sense. He picked up his radio and pressed the button. He said, "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. Linda's voice came back right away telling him to go ahead. Danny said he needed to speak with Sergeant Crawford. Greg Crawford was his shift supervisor, and Danny would need his approval for whatever he decided to do here. Linda said, "Stand by." While Danny waited, he watched Captain Stevens walk over to Kyle and say something. Kyle nodded and shook the captain's hand, and then started checking his motorcycle again like he was getting ready to ride. The radio crackled, and Sergeant Crawford's voice came through. Danny explained the whole situation. He said he stopped a motorcycle for speeding, and now there were 50 military people on scene saying this was federal priority business. He had gotten calls from Army intelligence, and there was a captain asking him to let the guy go. Crawford was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if Danny was in any danger. Danny said no, everyone had been professional about it, but he needed to know what to do. Another pause, and this one was even longer. Crawford said he had been on the phone for the last 10 minutes with the chief and the mayor's office and someone from the Department of Defense. He was being told this was a real federal operation, and the police department needed to cooperate and help out. He asked Danny if the credentials were checking out. Danny looked at the military IDs in his hand and the verification codes on his computer screen. and the convoy of soldiers all around him. He said, "Yes, everything looks legitimate." Crawford said, "Then let him go." This was above their pay grade. He told Danny to write down everything that happened and get names and badge numbers from everyone, and file a complete report when he got back to the station. But let them go ahead with whatever they were doing. Danny said he understood and signed off the radio. He got out of his car and walked toward Kyle, who was standing next to his motorcycle. Captain Stevens came over but kept some distance to give them space. Danny said, "Sergeant Bennett, I'm going to give you a warning for speeding. I expect you to keep a reasonable speed for road conditions and safety no matter what your orders say. If I get reports of reckless driving priority alpha or not, I will call every police agency between here and Nevada." Kyle nodded in a serious way. He said he understood and he did not take unnecessary risks. The speeding earlier was calculated based on road conditions and visibility and how much traffic there was. He would not put civilians in danger. Danny said, "See that you don't." He handed back all the documents. He said the credentials checked out and Kyle was free to go. Kyle said, "Thank you, officer," and he appreciated Danny being professional about this. He held out his hand and Danny shook it. Kyle's grip was firm but not aggressive. It was the handshake of someone who respected what Danny did even though the situation had been tense. Captain Stevens stepped forward and said, Danny had handled this really well. He would make sure a commendation for cooperation got sent to Danny's department. Danny said he was just doing his job. Then he paused and asked the question that had been bothering him. He asked if Kyle was really going to make a difference with this mission. The captain looked at Kyle, who was already getting on his motorcycle. He said if anyone could, it was Kyle. Sergeant Bennett had never failed a mission in 16 years, and they were counting on him not to start now. Kyle started the motorcycle and the engine made a deep rumbling sound that echoed across the desert. He gave Danny one last nod and then pulled back onto the highway. This time Danny noticed that Kyle accelerated smoothly and kept his speed at exactly 65 miles per hour. Just 5 over the limit. The convoy did not leave right away. Captain Stevens spent several more minutes making sure Danny had everything he needed for his report. He gave Danny contact information and authorization codes and a written statement on official military paper that explained the stop was related to federal operations. The captain said Danny's department would get a more detailed briefing in the next 24 hours. Some details would stay classified, but they would get enough information to keep the bosses happy. Danny asked if the captain could at least tell him where Kyle was going. Stevens thought about it for a second. He said Kyle was heading to a facility in Nevada, but beyond that, the details were need to know. Danny said Nevada was still a long way from here. The captain said about 600 miles, give or take. Kyle would make it with time to spare if he did not run into any more delays. The captain looked down the highway where Kyle's motorcycle had disappeared. He said Kyle had done a similar trip in Afghanistan once. He covered nearly 400 miles of enemy territory on a motorcycle to deliver intelligence that saved a whole battalion. This was easy compared to that. Danny asked if Kyle had done this kind of thing before. Stevens said not exactly this, but similar missions that needed individual initiative and specialized skills. Kyle had a talent for unconventional operations. His personnel file read like an adventure novel, and most of it was classified, but the parts that were not classified were impressive enough. One of the soldiers walked up to Captain Stevens and said something quietly that Danny could not hear. The captain nodded and turned back to Danny with a look that said it was time to wrap this up. He asked if there was anything else Danny needed from them. Danny thought for a moment and then asked one more question. He wanted to know if when this was all over and whatever mission Kyle was doing got completed, would Danny be able to find out what happened? Would he know if it made a difference? Captain Stevens's face became serious and sad at the same time. He said probably not, Officer Martinez. That was the nature of this kind of work. Most of what soldiers like Kyle accomplished never made the news and never got acknowledged in public. But he could tell Danny this. When Danny went home tonight and turned on the news and he did not hear about some major incident or crisis, there was a good chance it was because someone like Kyle did their job successfully. Sometimes the best outcomes were the ones that never made headlines. That made sense to Danny even though it was frustrating. He had chosen to be a cop, knowing that a lot of the work was thankless. The best days were often the quiet ones where nothing went wrong. It seemed like the military worked the same way. The soldiers started loading back into their vehicles, and they moved with the kind of precision that came from doing it 1,000 times. Within just a few minutes, the whole convoy was ready to move. Captain Stevens gave Danny a salute, and Danny returned it, even though he was not sure if he was doing it right. Danny said, "Safe travels, Captain." Stevens said, "Thank you, officer, and thank you for your service to your community." He said they all served in different ways, but they all served. Then the captain climbed into his Humvee and the door closed. The convoy pulled back onto the highway in the same tight formation they had arrived in. They headed north following the path Kyle had taken. Danny watched them disappear into the heat waves until he could not see them anymore, and the sound of their engines faded away into nothing. He stood alone, on the empty highway with his patrol, car's lights still flashing for no reason. The whole thing had lasted less than 30 minutes, but it felt like he had stepped into a completely different world. Danny got back in his car and turned off the lights. He sat there for a few minutes just thinking about what had happened. A routine traffic stop had turned into something he would probably remember for the rest of his career. He wondered how many other cops had experiences like this. How many times did regular police work intersect with secret military operations and nobody ever talked about it? He started his car and pulled back onto the highway heading south toward town. He had 3 more hours left on his shift and reports to write. Life would go back to normal now, except he would always wonder what Kyle Bennett was really doing out there in the desert. 2 hours later, Danny was sitting at his desk at the police station staring at a blank incident report form on his computer screen. How was he supposed to write up what had just happened? He had started the day expecting to write speeding tickets and ended up in the middle of something involving the Pentagon and satellite surveillance sergeant. Crawford appeared at his desk carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Danny and sat down in the chair next to the desk. Crawford said it had been one hell of a day. Danny took the coffee and said that was putting it mildly. He had been trying to write the report for 20 minutes and did not even know where to start. Crawford pulled out a folder and put it on the desk. He said this might help. They had received it from the Department of Defense about an hour ago. It was a template for reporting federal priority encounters. Basically, it walked officers through what to include and what to leave out. Danny opened the folder and looked through it. The template was surprisingly simple. Document the initial stop. Note the federal credentials that were presented. Describe the military response. Confirm that protocols were followed. Conclude with the resolution. There was a separate section for classified information, with a note that certain details would be removed before the report became part of the public record. Danny said they had done this before. Crawford said apparently so. The chief had talked to someone from the Pentagon who said these types of operations happened more often than the public knew about. Most of them did not involve traffic stops, but there were procedures in place for when civilian police ran into military business. Danny asked if the chief said anything about the actual mission or what Kyle was really doing. Crawford shook his head and said nobody was talking about that part. But just between the two of them, the level of response Danny got suggested something really important. 50 soldiers and a convoy of vehicles and satellite surveillance. That was not normal procedure for routine operations. Danny thought about what Captain Stevens had said. Missions that saved lives but never made the news. He wondered what Kyle was doing right now. Probably still riding through the desert racing against some clock for reasons that would stay secret forever. Danny said the captain mentioned Kyle had been doing this kind of work for 16 years. He wondered how many missions someone completed in that much time. Crawford stood up, getting ready to leave. He said there was no way to know, but if Kyle was as good as they said, probably hundreds. Maybe thousands if you counted all the small operations that did not need full convoy support. Crawford told Danny to get the report finished and filed before the end of his shift. Then he said Danny had handled the situation well. Not everyone would have kept their cool with 50 armed soldiers showing up out of nowhere. After Crawford left, Danny worked on the report and carefully wrote down every detail he could remember. The whole time he kept thinking about Kyle Bennett, a soldier who had spent 16 years completing missions that most people would never know about. Riding through deserts and war zones, carrying things or delivering messages or doing whatever needed to be done to keep people safe. And nobody would ever thank him for it because nobody would ever know. Danny finished the report and submitted it through the system. He looked at the clock and saw his shift was almost over. He gathered his things and headed out to the parking lot where his personal car waited. The sun was setting now and the sky was turning orange and purple just like it had been when Kyle rode away. He got in his car and started driving home thinking about his conversation with Captain Stevens. The best outcomes are the ones that never make headlines. Tomorrow, Danny would wake up and go back to work and pull over more speeding cars and write more tickets. Life would continue like normal. And somewhere out there, Kyle Bennett would be riding his motorcycle toward Nevada, carrying secrets that Danny would never learn. Kyle Bennett pushed his motorcycle through the Nevada desert as the sun dropped lower in the sky behind him. The landscape turned orange and purple and the shadows grew long across the sand. His GPS showed he had 40 miles left to reach his destination, and his watch told him he still had 6 hours of extra time. The stop back in Arizona had been unexpected, but he had dealt with it and now he was back on schedule. He thought about Officer Martinez for a minute. That young cop had just been doing his job and suddenly found himself in the middle of something way beyond normal traffic duty. Kyle respected that. Police work and military service were different sides of the same coin. Both were about people who chose to serve and put themselves between danger and regular citizens who just wanted to live their lives in peace. The facility appeared on the horizon as a cluster of low buildings surrounded by tall fences and guard towers. Kyle slowed his motorcycle and rode toward the main gate where armed guards stood waiting. He stopped and pulled out his credentials. The guards scanned them and checked his face against their database. They waved him through after a minute. Inside the compound, a woman in a white lab coat was waiting for him. She looked about 50 years old with gray hair pulled back tight, and eyes that showed she was tired but also very focused. She walked up as Kyle parked his motorcycle and took off his helmet. She said her name was Dr. Laura Price, and she thanked him for getting there so quickly. Her voice had an edge of urgency to it that made Kyle pay attention. He said yes, ma'am, and asked what situation needed his specialized handling. Dr. Price said that was putting it mildly and told him to follow her. She led him through hallways made of thick concrete that felt cool after the desert heat. They went deeper into the facility until they reached a secure laboratory. Inside the lab, a team of people in white coats worked around a large metal container that hummed with the sound of cooling systems running. Dr. Price walked to a control panel and pulled up readings on a computer screen. She said that 3 days ago they discovered a critical problem with one of their containment systems. They had biological samples here that needed immediate transport to a secure CDC facility in Maryland for analysis and safe disposal. The samples were extremely sensitive to temperature changes and vibration and electromagnetic interference. Kyle looked at the containment unit. It was about the size of a large backpack, and it had lots of displays and gauges on it to monitor whatever was inside. He asked why they could not just fly it there. Dr. Price said the samples would be exposed to pressure changes from high altitude and might get detected by security systems at civilian airports. Ground transport by truck would take too long, and the vibration from truck suspension would be too much. They needed someone who could move the samples, quickly and smoothly and under the radar, so to speak. She looked at Kyle and said Captain Stevens told her that Kyle once transported similar materials 300 miles through a war zone on a motorcycle without breaking the containment. Kyle said that was different terrain, but yes, he had done it. He asked what the timeline was. Dr. Price said the containment system's backup batteries would keep everything stable for 72 hours from right now. After that, they risked a breach and potential contamination. Her face was very serious when she said this. Kyle did the math in his head. Nevada to Maryland was roughly 2,500 miles. On a motorcycle, keeping safe speeds with stops for gas and rest, it would take about 40 hours of riding. It would be tight, but he could do it. He said he would need detailed route planning and weather forecasts and backup containment protocols. He started to say, what if something goes wrong, but Dr. Price cut him off. She said if something went wrong, Sergeant Bennett, they could be looking at a public health crisis that would be in the news for years. These samples were from a research program that was supposed to protect people, not put them in danger. They needed the samples secured properly, and that meant getting them to Maryland safely. Kyle nodded slowly. This was why Captain Stevens had sent a whole convoy to make sure he got here on time. This was why a simple traffic stop had triggered a response from Army intelligence. Somewhere inside that humming metal container were materials that could hurt thousands of people if they were mishandled or if the containment failed. He looked at Dr. Price and said he would get the samples to Maryland, and she had his word on that. She looked relieved, and some of the tension left her shoulders. 3 hours later, Kyle was back on his motorcycle heading east into the darkness. The containment unit was secured to his bike with special mounting brackets that the lab technicians had installed. The unit was heavy but balanced, and Kyle had tested it by riding in circles around the parking lot until he was satisfied it would not shift or vibrate. Loose. Behind him, invisible but always watching, satellite cameras tracked his progress across the desert. Ahead of him, backup teams were positioned along his planned route, ready to respond if anything went wrong. Captain Stevens had told him there would be support every 100 miles or so. People he would never see, but who would be there if he needed them. Kyle opened the throttle smoothly and let the motorcycle settle into a comfortable cruising speed. The night air was cool and clear, and the stars were incredibly bright out here, away from city lights. His headlight cut through the darkness, and the white lines on the road flew past underneath him. He had done missions like this before, but never across this much distance on American soil. In Afghanistan and Iraq, he had carried important items through dangerous territory, where people were actively trying to kill him. This was different. The danger here was not enemy fighters, but time and distance and the possibility of mechanical failure or accident. The containment unit had its own power source and monitoring systems. A small display on his handlebars showed him the internal temperature and status. Everything was green. Everything was stable. He just needed to keep it that way for the next 40 hours. Kyle thought about Officer Martinez again and wondered if the cop had any idea what he had been part of. Probably not. The report would get filed and marked classified, and Danny would go back to writing speeding tickets, never knowing that his decision to let Kyle go might have prevented a disaster. That was okay. Kyle had learned a long time ago that most of the important work happened in silence. Nobody would give him a medal for this ride. Nobody would write news stories about it. If he succeeded, people would wake up tomorrow and go to work and live their lives and never know how close they came to something bad. And that was exactly how it should be. The miles disappeared beneath Kyle's wheels as he rode through the Nevada night. The highway was mostly empty at this hour, with just an occasional truck passing in the opposite direction. Every time a vehicle approached, Kyle checked his mirrors and made sure the containment unit was still secure. The display on his handlebars continued to show green across all readings. At the 2-hour mark, he crossed into Utah. The terrain changed from flat desert to rolling hills, and then gradually into mountains. Kyle adjusted his speed for the curves and inclines but kept pushing forward. Time was always moving, and the 72-hour window was always counting down. He stopped for gas at a small station just off the interstate. It was 3 a.m, and the place was deserted except for a tired-looking clerk behind bulletproof glass. Kyle filled his tank and checked the containment unit carefully. All the straps were tight. All the monitors showed normal. He bought a bottle of water and a protein bar, and ate standing next to his bike under the harsh fluorescent lights. The clerk watched him through the window with mild curiosity, but did not come out to talk. Kyle was grateful for that. He did not want to answer questions about what he was carrying or where he was going. He finished his water and threw the bottle in the trash and got back on the road. Somewhere above him, a satellite adjusted its orbit slightly to keep him in view. Somewhere behind him, Captain Stevens was probably sitting in an operations center, watching a screen that showed Kyle's position as a blinking dot moving across a map. Somewhere ahead of him, teams were on standby, ready to mobilize if the green lights on his handlebars ever turned red. But for now, Kyle was alone with just the sound of his engine and the wind and the dark road ahead. This was the part of the job he actually liked. No politics, no bureaucracy, just a mission and the skills to complete it, and the trust that he would get it done. He thought about Dr. Price and the way she had looked when she explained what was in the containment unit. She had not gone into details about exactly what kind of biological samples they were. She did not need to. Kyle had transported enough dangerous materials over the years to understand that some things were better left as general descriptions rather than specific facts. What mattered was that the samples needed to get to Maryland, and they needed to get there safely. Everything else was just noise. The sky started to lighten in the east as dawn approached. Kyle had been riding for 8 hours straight, and he could feel the fatigue starting to creep into his shoulders and lower back. He needed rest, but he also needed to make progress. He decided to push through until sunrise and then find a place to stop for a few hours of sleep. The sun came up over the mountains ahead of him, painting the rocks in shades of gold and red. Kyle rolled his shoulders and stretched his neck as much as he could while still controlling the bike. The morning air was cold and crisp, and it helped wake him up a little. He saw a rest area sign and made the decision to stop. It was not much, just a parking lot with some picnic tables and bathrooms and a couple of vending machines. But it would do. Kyle pulled in and parked in a spot far away from the few other vehicles there. He shut off the engine, and the sudden silence was almost shocking after so many hours of constant noise. His legs were stiff as he climbed off the bike. He walked in circles for a minute to get the blood flowing again. Then he checked the containment unit for what felt like the 100th time. Still green. Still stable. Still good. Kyle pulled out his phone and sent a short text message to a number he had memorized years ago. The message just said location and status. 2 minutes later, he got a reply that said received and acknowledged. Captain Stevens and his team knew where Kyle was and that everything was okay. Kyle found a picnic table in the shade and sat down. He set an alarm on his phone for 3 hours from now. That would give him enough rest to keep going safely. He folded his arms on the table and put his head down and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly and deeply. His body knew how to grab rest whenever and wherever it was available. This was a skill learned from years of deployments where you slept when you could, because you never knew when the next chance would come. The alarm woke him exactly 3 hours later. Kyle sat up and blinked in the bright sunlight. His back was sore and his neck was stiff, but he felt better than before. He stood and stretched and walked to the bathroom to splash cold water on his face. When he came back to the bike, there was an old man standing next to it looking at the containment unit with curiosity. The man had white hair and wore jeans and a flannel shirt. He looked friendly enough, but Kyle immediately went on alert. The old man said that was quite a setup Kyle had there, asked if he was some kind of delivery rider. Kyle smiled politely and said something like that. The man asked what was in the case, and Kyle said just equipment for his job. Nothing interesting. The old man nodded like he understood and said his son was in the army. Served 2 tours in Iraq. Kyle said that was good and thanked him for his son's service. The man asked if Kyle was military too, something about the way Kyle carried himself maybe, or the way he had set up his bike. Kyle said he was but did not elaborate. The old man seemed to sense that Kyle did not want to talk much, and he said, "Well, be safe out there," and walked back to his own truck. Kyle watched him drive away and then did another complete check of the containment unit even though he knew it was fine. He was being paranoid, but paranoia kept you alive in this line of work. Better to check everything twice than to assume everything was okay and find out later you were wrong. Kyle got back on his motorcycle and pulled out of the rest area. The sun was high in the sky now and the day was getting hot. He had covered about 600 miles so far, which meant he had about 1,900 left to go. The math said he would reach Maryland sometime tomorrow evening if he kept up this pace. The highway stretched ahead through Colorado now. The landscape changed again from desert mountains to plains and grasslands. Kyle settled into the rhythm of long-distance riding. His mind went into a kind of meditative state where he was aware of everything around him, but not actively thinking about much. Just riding and breathing and watching the road. By late afternoon, Kyle had crossed into Kansas. The plain stretched out flat and endless in every direction. The sky was huge and empty except for a few scattered clouds. Traffic was light on this section of highway, and Kyle made good time. He stopped for gas again and to grab food from a fast food place next to the station. He ate in the parking lot standing next to his bike because sitting down would make him too comfortable, and he might not want to get back up. The burger was mediocre, but it was calories and protein, and that was all that mattered. A state trooper pulled into the gas station while Kyle was there. The officer looked at Kyle and his motorcycle and the containment unit but did not approach. Kyle wondered if the word had gone out through law enforcement channels. "Do not stop this bike. Do not interfere. Just let him pass." It was possible. Captain Stevens had mentioned they were coordinating with agencies along the route. The trooper filled up his patrol car and left without saying anything. Kyle finished his food and checked the containment unit again. Still green. He was starting to feel like the green lights were the only constant thing in the universe right now. He sent another status update to Captain Stevens and got back the same reply. Received and acknowledged. Kyle imagined the operations center where people were probably sitting around drinking coffee and watching his dot move across their map. It seemed strange to him that so much effort was being devoted to one man on a motorcycle, but he understood the reasoning. The containment could not fail. The mission could not fail. Therefore, whatever resources were needed would be provided. That was how the military worked when something was truly important. Overwhelming force. Redundant systems. Leave nothing to chance. Kyle appreciated it even though part of him felt like all the support was unnecessary. He had done harder things with less backup. But he was not complaining. He got back on the road as the sun started to set again. Another night of riding ahead of him. His body was feeling the strain now. 2 nights with only a few hours of sleep. Thousands of miles of vibration and wind and concentration. His hands were sore from gripping the handlebars. His legs were cramped from holding the same position for so long, but he had been through worse. Much worse. He remembered patrols in Afghanistan that lasted for days with no sleep at all. He remembered riding through Iraq in the middle of summer when the temperature hit 120 degrees. This was uncomfortable, but it was not unbearable. As darkness fell, Kyle turned on his headlight and continued east. Missouri passed beneath him, then Illinois. He stopped once more for gas and once more for a short rest at another rest area. Each time he checked the containment unit. Each time everything was green. The night stretched on. Kyle's world narrowed down to the cone of light from his headlight, and the white lines of the highway and the steady rumble of his engine. Other vehicles appeared and disappeared. Towns came and went, marked by brief clusters of lights. The stars wheeled overhead, tracking the passage of time. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Kyle crossed into Indiana. He was getting close now. Less than 500 miles to go. The finish line was in sight even though it was still hours away. He felt a surge of energy knowing that the end was approaching. This mission was almost complete. He pushed through the rest of the night and into the dawn of his 3rd day on the road. The sun came up over flat farmland that stretched away in neat rows of crops. Kyle's eyes burned with fatigue and his whole body ached, but he kept going. He stopped for coffee at a truck stop and drank it black and scalding hot. The caffeine hit his system like a shock and gave him the boost he needed. Ohio came next. The highway got busier as he approached more populated areas. Kyle had to pay more attention to traffic now. Cars and trucks surrounded him and he wove between them smoothly when he needed to pass. The containment unit drew a few curious looks from other drivers, but nobody tried to stop him or ask questions. By noon, he was in Pennsylvania. The terrain became hilly again with forests covering the slopes. Kyle had been riding for nearly 36 hours with only 2 short breaks for sleep. His mind felt fuzzy around the edges and he had to consciously focus on staying alert. Fatigue was dangerous. It slowed reaction times and dulled judgment. He could not afford to make a mistake now when he was so close. He stopped at another rest area and got out to walk around. His legs almost did not want to support him at first. He walked in circles, breathing deeply and forcing his blood to circulate. Then he did some stretches that probably looked ridiculous to anyone watching, but he did not care. His muscles needed it. The containment unit showed 30 hours remaining on its battery. Kyle had 12 hours of cushion before the 72-hour deadline. He would make it with time to spare. Barring some catastrophic mechanical failure or accident, he would deliver the samples safely to Maryland. He thought about Dr. Price back in Nevada, probably sitting in that lab watching her own countdown clock. He thought about Captain Stevens in the operations center tracking his progress. He thought about all the backup teams positioned along his route who had been on standby for days waiting for a call that never came, because Kyle had not needed them, and he thought about Officer Martinez back in Arizona writing his report and probably wondering what all of this had been about. Kyle smiled slightly. Danny Martinez had been part of something important even if he never knew exactly what. Kyle sent one more status update saying he was in Pennsylvania and on schedule. The reply came back immediately. Final approach acknowledged. CDC facility has been notified of your ETA. Well done, Sergeant Bennett. Kyle put his phone away and got back on his motorcycle. The last leg of the journey stretched ahead. A few more hours of riding and this mission would be complete. He started the engine and pulled back onto the highway heading east toward Maryland and the finish line. The CDC facility was located outside Baltimore in a secure area surrounded by fences and guard posts. Kyle reached the outskirts of the city as the sun began to set on his 3rd day of riding. Traffic was heavy with evening commuters heading home from work. Kyle navigated through the cars and trucks with practiced skill even, Though his exhaustion was becoming hard to ignore, he followed the GPS coordinates he had been given to a small access road that led away from the main highway. The road wound through some woods for about a mile before reaching a security checkpoint. Kyle stopped at the gate and pulled out his credentials. The guard studied them carefully and made a phone call. After a minute, the gate opened and Kyle was waved through. The facility itself looked like an ordinary office building from the outside. Nothing about it suggested the dangerous materials that were handled inside. Kyle supposed that was intentional. No need to advertise what went on here. He parked his motorcycle in a designated area near the main entrance and shut off the engine. The silence that followed was profound. After nearly 40 hours of constant engine noise and wind, the sudden quiet felt almost unnatural. Kyle sat on his bike for a moment, just breathing and letting his body adjust. His hands were shaking slightly from fatigue and accumulated vibration. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The front door of the building opened and two people in white containment suits walked out. They moved carefully and deliberately. Behind them came a woman in regular clothes who looked like she was in charge. She approached Kyle while the suited figures hung back. She introduced herself as Dr. Helen Carter from the CDC. She said they had been expecting him and were ready to receive the samples. She thanked him for getting here safely and on time. Her voice was professional, but Kyle could hear the relief in it. Kyle dismounted from the motorcycle, moving slowly, because his body did not want to cooperate. He walked around to the containment unit and began unfastening the mounting brackets. The two people in containment suits moved forward to help, but Kyle waved them off. He wanted to hand over the unit himself. He had carried it this far and he would see it through to the end. He lifted the containment unit free and checked the display one last time. Still green. Still stable. 40 hours of riding and the samples had remained safe the entire way. He handed the unit to the suited figures, who took it with extreme care and turned to carry it inside the building. Dr. Carter asked Kyle if he wanted to come inside and rest. They had facilities where he could shower and sleep before heading back. Kyle thanked her but said he would find a hotel nearby. He needed to be away from this place now that his job was done. Being here would just make him think about what might have happened if something had gone wrong. Dr. Carter understood. She handed him a form to sign acknowledging delivery. Kyle signed it and gave it back. She said the Army would be notified that the mission was complete and successful. She shook his hand and thanked him again. Then she turned and followed the containment suits into the building, leaving Kyle alone in the parking lot. Kyle pulled out his phone and called Captain Stevens. The captain answered on the first ring. Kyle said mission complete. Samples delivered safely to CDC facility. Stevens said outstanding work, Sergeant Bennett. He asked if Kyle was okay. Kyle said he was tired but fine. Stevens said a debrief would be scheduled for next week after Kyle had time to rest. Kyle said understood and ended the call. He stood next to his motorcycle for a few minutes, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in that building, the samples he had transported were being analyzed and processed. Whatever danger they represented was now being handled by people who specialized in that kind of work. His part was done. Kyle thought about the journey. 2,500 miles across 8 states in less than 40 hours. One traffic stop that could have derailed everything but did not. One cop who made the right decision even though he did not have all the information. One motorcycle that performed flawlessly despite the constant punishment of highway riding. And now it was over. The mission that had consumed the last 3 days was complete. Kyle would file his report and attend his debrief and then wait for the next assignment. That was how it worked. One mission ended and another began. There was always something that needed to be done. He got back on his motorcycle and started the engine one more time. He rode slowly out of the facility and back onto the main roads. He found a hotel near the airport and checked in using the government credit card he carried for official travel. The room was clean and quiet and the bed looked impossibly comfortable. Kyle took a long, hot shower that helped ease some of the stiffness in his muscles. He ordered room service because he was too tired to go find a restaurant. When the food arrived, he ate mechanically without really tasting it. Calories and protein, that was all it was. After eating, he sat on the edge of the bed and thought about calling someone. His sister, maybe. His old friend from basic training. But he did not. What would he say? He could not talk about the mission. He could not explain where he had been or what he had done. And small talk felt impossible right now when his brain was running on fumes. Instead, he lay down on the bed, still wearing his clothes, and closed his eyes. Sleep came instantly and completely. His body finally got the rest it had been begging for. He slept through the night without moving and woke up 12 hours later, feeling almost human again. The next morning, Kyle checked the news on his phone while drinking coffee in the hotel room. Nothing unusual. No headlines about biological contamination or public health crises. No breaking news about disasters averted. The world continued turning peacefully and quietly, just like Captain Stevens had told Officer Martinez. Sometimes the best outcomes were the ones that never made headlines. Kyle had transported dangerous materials across the country and delivered them safely, and now the threat they represented was being neutralized. And nobody except a few dozen people would ever know it had happened. Kyle finished his coffee and packed his things. He would ride back to Fort Bragg today. Not in a rush this time. He would take his time and enjoy the journey and maybe stop to see some sights along the way. The mission was over and he had earned a leisurely trip home. As he walked out to the parking lot and approached his motorcycle, he thought one more time about Danny Martinez, that cop back in Arizona who had pulled him over for speeding and ended up part of something bigger than he realized. Kyle hoped Danny never found out what was really in that containment unit or what might have happened if it had failed. Some knowledge was a burden. But Kyle also hoped that somehow Danny understood that his decision to let Kyle continue had mattered, that his choice to trust in something bigger than a traffic violation had made a difference. Because it had. In ways that Danny would never know, Kyle's mission had kept people safe. And that was enough. That was always enough. Service was not about recognition or thanks. It was about doing what needed to be done when it needed to be done. Kyle had learned that lesson a long time ago, and he lived by it every day. He started his motorcycle and pulled out of the hotel parking lot. The morning sun was warm on his face, and the road ahead was clear. He had completed another mission successfully. He had kept his perfect record intact. 16 years and still going strong. Somewhere in Arizona, Danny Martinez was probably pulling over another speeding car. Somewhere in Nevada, Dr. Price was probably breathing easier knowing the samples were safe. Somewhere in an operations center, Captain Stevens was probably planning the next mission that would need someone like Kyle. And Kyle rode on, carrying the weight of secrets that would never be told and doing the work that would never be acknowledged, because that was what soldiers like him did. They served in silence and they kept the world safe, and they asked for nothing in return except the chance to do it again tomorrow. The road stretched ahead and Kyle followed it home.